President, I want to compliment my colleague from Wyoming and before him my colleague from Texas for talking about the issues that are important to the American people. People in this country care about jobs and the economy. I think one of the reasons that there weren't more Democrat senators down here last night is a lot of those, as someone had pointed out, hit the snooze button, didn't want to come down here and talk about an issue which they realize ranks very, very low in people's assessment of what's really important in their daily lives. And I think that's probably why most Americans, by and large, tuned out the all-night session that we had here on the floor. But we did have a number of Senate Democrats came down and engaged in what we referred to as a talkathon on climate change. And I don't know who coined the term talkathon to describe the event, but it's a perfect term. It really fits, since the event was all talk and no action. In fact, writing ahead of the talkathon, USA Today noted, and I quote, "The Democratic effort is cause for some confusion because these senators are calling for action in a chamber they control, but without any specific legislation to offer up for a vote or any timetable for action this year," end quote. Well, that's exactly right. Last night's filibuster was not designed to advance any legislation, nor was it a protest about the lack of legislation, since after the Democrats control the chamber, since after all, I should say, the Democrats control the chamber and can bring up a bill anytime they want to. No, last night's event may have had all the trappings of significant Senate action, but it was nothing but talk. If Democrats really think government action on climate change is so important, one would assume that they would have used last night to debate a bill, or at least to try to persuade their leadership to bring one up on the floor. But they didn't, because it's an election year, and Democrats are already deeply worried about their election prospects. And they know very well that the American people don't like the climate change legislation that they've offered up. The climate change bills Democrats have proposed almost invariably involve tax hikes that would drive the cost of energy sky high for ordinary families and kill jobs, all for extremely dubious environmental gains. The last time Congress debated a cap-and-trade bill was in 2009. That bill was estimated to destroy 2.5 million jobs. Perhaps that's why several Democrats who represent energy-producing states didn't make it to last night's talkathon. They must be tired of defending more job-destroying policies. And for families who are already struggling with the reduced income and high health care costs that have characterized the Obama economy for the past 5 years, increased energy prices and more job losses are the last thing that they want to face. So, Madam President, Democrats know that climate change legislation is a non-starter in an election year. But they still have their radical environmental base to worry about, the same base that is pushing the president not to approve the Keystone Pipeline despite 5 separate environmental reviews that found that its impact on the environment would be negligible. Last night's talkathon, designed for maximum media exposure, allowed Democrats to assure their donors that they're focused on climate change without actually having to do anything that would be difficult or politically damaging, like going on the record and actually voting for a specific bill. Madam President, last month, Gallup released a poll on America's top concerns. Climate change didn't even make the top 10. Jobs and the economy, on the other hand, came in at the very top, not surprisingly. The American people, I think, have a very good assessment of what's important. And Gallup polling shows that those two issues have been among Americans' top 5 concerns for most of the past 6 years. Despite this, however, Democrats have shown very little inclination to take real action on the economy. In fact, most of their policies are making our economic situation worse. And the policy that's doing the most economic damage is Obamacare. Any way you look at it, Obamacare means bad economic news for just about everybody. Millions of Americans have had the plans they like canceled, and far too many of them have found that their Obamacare alternative will cost more and offer them less. Families around the country have enrolled in exchange plans that have left them wondering how they're going to be able to afford the plan's $10,000 and $12,000 deductibles. Low-income seniors enrolled in Medicare Advantage and wondering how will they afford the premium hikes or the benefit reductions that will soon hit them thanks to Obamacare's Medicare cuts. And 11 million small business workers are not sure how a bill that promised more affordable health care is actually raising their health care costs. And then there are the businesses who are changing their plans to hire new workers because Obamacare's mandates and fees mean they can't afford to expand. And the workers who are having their hours cut because Obamacare means that their employer can't afford to keep them on as full-time workers. The Congressional Budget Office recently estimated that Obamacare will mean 2.5 million fewer full-time workers and approximately $1 trillion in lower wages. Well, Madam President, that is a lot of lost economic opportunity. But you don't have to take my word for it, because Republicans are not the only people who are worried about Obamacare's effects on the economy and on the middle class. A lot of the President's allies are worried too. Democrats that are running in red states are running scared and starting to talk about the need to amend the law. And then there are the unions. Unions are, of course, historically Democratic supporters, and they were instrumental in getting Obamacare passed in the first place and helping to get the president reelected. But now unions are rethinking their support. At the end of last week, Unite Here, which is a huge union with over 250,000 members from all over the hospitality industry, published a white paper on Obamacare, which they called "The Irony of Obamacare Making Inequality Worse." And what does the document say? Well, it says what Republicans have been saying all along, that Obamacare is going to make things much, much worse for the middle class. And I want to quote from the first page. It says this: "Ironically, the administration's own signature health care victory poses one of the most immediate challenges to redressing inequality. Without smart fixes, the Affordable Care Act threatens the middle class with higher premiums, loss of hours, and a shift to part-time work and less comprehensive coverage." End quote. That's from a white paper put out by one of the nation's major unions. In 12 pages, that document demolishes the administration's claims that the bill will help the middle class. It takes aim at the administration's ridiculous assertion that the law will not discourage business expansion or result in employers cutting hours. Worker hours, the union points out, have already been cut at nearly a third of U.S. franchise businesses. Other businesses have chosen to replace full-time workers with part-time workers, and still others have announced their intention of staying below 50 employees to avoid being hit by the worst of the law's mandates. The union also points out the likelihood of employers dumping employee health plans thanks to the law's requirements, leaving employees to obtain health care in the exchanges. And here's what the union has to say about dropped employees. And again, I quote, "For dropped employees, being pushed onto the exchanges will mean a major loss of income or health benefits. Families moving to the exchanges may lose between 4% and 25% of income to maintain equivalent benefits." End quote. Again, that's from the union white paper on Obamacare. Major loss of income or health benefits. Families moving to the exchanges may lose between 4% and 25% of income. Between 4% and 25% of income. Now, we're not talking about rich families here. We're talking about families that are making $40,000 and $50,000 and $60,000 a year. Even a 4% income loss would make a huge dent in these families' budgets. A 25% income loss for a family making that amount of money, Madam President, would be devastating. And finally, the union concludes by pointing out a study in the Brookings Institution, again, not exactly a bastion of conservatism, that shows that those making below $20,000 will get some benefit from the Affordable Care Act, but that those right above them, families with incomes of $20,000 to $38,000, will lose income. Only in Washington, the report concludes, could asking the bottom of the middle class to finance health care for the poorest families be seen as reducing inequality. And again, that's a quote from that report by Unite Here, a labor union. I want to remind everyone that this is not a Republican document. It's a document produced by some of President Obama's biggest supporters. In fact, Unite Here was actually the first union to endorse then Senator Obama in 2008. So this isn't an organization seeking to damage the president politically or to provide Republicans with talking points. But like so many Americans around the country, Unite Here has been forced to an inescapable conclusion. And that conclusion is that Obamacare just isn't working. It is doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. It's making health care more expensive for families. It's discouraging employees from hiring. It's reducing Americans' health care choices. Madam President, I ask for an additional minute. Unanimous consent.
Without objection.
It's reducing Americans' health care choices, and it's encouraging employers to cut hours and benefits. Our health care system may have needed reform, but this was not the way to do it. Even the president's strongest supporters are having buyer's remorse. And Madam President, a lot of Americans are hurting right now thanks to the president's health care law. As we hear from more and more Americans, more and more South Dakotans, people all across this country who are struggling under the law's burdens, I hope the Democrats here, who I believe privately are rethinking their vote for this law, will have the courage to publicly join us in calling for its repeal. Madam President, I yield the floor.